I am being watched. Welcome everyone to Person of Interest Season 1 Episode 9. I had to check the number there. This is called Get Carter, and as expected, it's a Carter focused episode. That was kind of obvious from the title. So we got a bit more of her. The flashbacks this episode are for her. And the thing that I did not predict for this episode is that Carter herself would be the number. She is the potential victim that has been pointed out by the machine. And I thought the episode did a good job of kind of setting that up, where we actually stuck with her right at the start of the episode for a little bit before we even got to, Reese and Finch. And they kind of telegraphed it in a way that I think was good foreshadowing, where, Hector Salamanca from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, who it turns out is the gangster who is the father of Elias. This man is definitely typecast a little bit as the mob boss, right? He's definitely got a little bit of that going on. But he says, hey, you're coming after Elias, and he knows that, so it sounds like he might come after you. And that was kind of like the first moment of the episode where I went, oh, wait a minute, I get what this is doing. She's going to be the target. And sure enough, that's what it turns out to be. So it presents this opportunity. I wasn't sure how much we were going to get this episode of Reese actually being one-on-one with Carter, given how close he tends to get to the people he's protecting, where they get to actually meet him and talk to him. I thought that might happen in this episode, and it doesn't really. Obviously, you've got the shadowy moment at the end, but they still kind of hold their cards a bit close to their chest with that particular progression in their story. We're obviously going to get it at some point, probably later in the season, but for this episode it focused on something else that I am actually going to compare to Batman a little bit. There's a lot of natural comparisons to Batman with this show. I've often referred to Carter as the Jim Gordon of this world, and sure enough, this episode went further with that, and kind of her backstory, and the key theme of this episode being that she is this good cop who plays by the rules, who actually cares about protecting people, which the episode also does a good job of tying that into what Reese and Finch do. Reese says that at one point, we're not just protecting someone innocent, we're protecting someone who's tried to do what we're doing her entire career, her entire life. She's been trying to protect people, and it shows that in this episode, specifically with the abusive husband and the wife that come up early on, and then she's going out of her way to try and protect this woman. She's trying to stop a homicide from happening in advance, because as they point out repeatedly, she's not the cop that's there to do domestic violent cases. That's not her department. She's a homicide detective, but she recognizes that there's a good chance that will turn into a homicide, so she's trying to prevent it, which is exactly what Reese and Finch do typically, right? But the big thing is that, she's surrounded by corrupt cops. That's something that we've seen with Lionel. We see it more in this episode with his old captain, and this hit on Carter is going through the corrupt part of the police force. Elias, in many ways, we hear in this episode, we only see him briefly, other than a photo. We see him for one scene, which was exciting to see him. It was like, oh, hey, he's still around. We still got the actor. We're still doing all this stuff. But it's going through the corrupt side of the police force, the organized crime, and the way that's synced up to the corrupt police officers and them working together. Is that's something that's kind of coming back in full force with the way Elias is running things. So it further puts this idea that Carter is this one good cop surrounded by corruption and surrounded by people who do not have her back. And that's what the flashbacks tie into. The flashbacks, largely it's her interrogating this guy who works with Al-Qaeda and helps move explosives around. But she ultimately appeals to him through the idea that this is what's best for him and his family, it's best for his son. And the flashback stuff does a nice job of tying into the fact that we meet Carter's son this episode. She's a single mother, she's got a teenage son. And also the idea that she's trying to get this guy who works at the bodega, which is a word I only learned in the last few years, or at least found out what it meant. I think it was the Spider-Man Miles Morales video game, which is set in New York, where I finally learned what a bodega was, and all it is a shop. It's just a corner shop, basically. But I thought about that this episode, that I only just learned what bodega actually was. It's one of those things where the word gets thrown around, obviously, especially stuff set in New York, and it never occurred to me what it was until a few years ago. It's just one of those little cultural things. But she's trying to convince this guy who maybe saw something with a shooting, right? There's this guy who's gunned down, which is kind of what her case is focusing on in the episode. And she's trying to get this guy to tell her something, and he's too scared because the gangs in this area will kill snitches. They will kill you if they even think that you're talking to the police. So the flashback stuff ties in with her trying to like get someone to open up and talk about a crime. It connects to her and her son. And ultimately, I think the biggest deal for me is that when she does get this guy in the flashback to sort of give up a location where the bombs are, the other officers, the other guys in the military, when they come back and say, hey, we found the explosives, we dealt with it. And she's like, hey, where's the guy that gave us the information? And they're like, oh, he didn't make it back. And he refers to him, I can't remember what the word was, but it was like a slur for Middle Eastern people. And it's like, she appealed to this guy's humanity. She got him to help and promised that she would help protect him and his family. And the others around her just disregarded that. Maybe didn't even know she'd made that promise, but certainly acted on their own and corrupt effectively. And the guy makes it very clear that you can be on your high horse when she sort of fights back and gets upset about it. So you can be on your high horse, but me and my men won't back you up. Basically saying she's on her own. She doesn't have the camaraderie or the backup from those around her because she's too much trying to stand up for what's right, and that doesn't work for the others around her. And that's something we see in her police career as well, is that the people around her are kind of leaving her on her own. And this is all very important though, because the reason why this is all good and the reason why this is all really effective in the episode is because the entire point of her relationship with Reese is that Reese does have her back. And that's what this entire episode is that he's there looking out for her in the shadows. And ultimately, when she is attacked, because a big part of this episode is, okay, where's the threat actually going to come from? Because in her line of work, she has multiple enemies. She has the crime boss who might have gunned down this young guy, possibly wanting to kill her. Elias wants to kill her, who always feels like the real threat, I think, from the viewer perspective. But there's also this abusive husband. The question is Elias going to go through any of these channels to achieve this hit? Or, what direction is it going to come from? There's a lot of try to guess where it's coming from. And it ends up being this crime informant who's been kind of nice to her throughout the episode, which, if I'm going to throw a critique, is that maybe that's like an obvious swerve. Is like, okay, the one who's a bit nicer and innocent with her is where the threat's going to come from. That almost feels like it is a bit predictable, just for the twist factor of it, I guess. But it still works, because ultimately when we get this scene towards the end of the episode where she is shot, she's wearing a bulletproof vest because she's accepted the warning from Reese over the phone that she is in danger. She is almost going to get killed properly though, because the guy's got the gun to her head, and that's when Reese intervenes and shoots the CI who's about to kill her. And this pairs nicely because it flashes back at this point to her conflicting with the military in the past, and it cuts back to Reese. So the two statements are basically side by side, where the guy in the flashback says, we won't have your back. We come to the present day, and Reese is like, look, I know you'll arrest me if you get the chance, but I've got your back, right? I'm looking out for you, I'm on your side, kind of thing. And that's kind of what the whole point of this episode is at the very end of the episode, she hears the motorbike leaving in the alleyway, and she hears the same engine again after she's talking to her son in the final scene at the diner. And there's just that moment where she doesn't know for sure that it's Reese who's going past, but it sort of makes her think, because her son's just asked the question, who's looking out for you? And she sort of hears the engine, and it's maybe that's realization that this mysterious man in the suit, whoever he may be, is actually looking out for me more than my actual colleagues are, than the people who are supposed to be looking out for me are. And I think, I think that narrative point, if that's the purpose of this episode, that point lands at the end quite well and sets up that she is going to maybe be more sympathetic, or at the very least conflicted when it comes time to maybe have to pursue Reese again. What's interesting from this episode to me is that this is probably the least Finch there is in any episode, because it does focus so much on Carter, and there's so many scenes of Carter doing her job, interacting with her various cases that are all potentially dangerous to her, that Finch takes a back seat in this episode. He bugs the car at the start and the end, and obviously he talks to Reese a few times, but he does take a back seat as far as being involved this time, and certainly screen time he's not there as much. But of course, I do appreciate though that Reese gets to hear this final scene with the son, and the justification for it and the plot is that him and Finch are actually taking out the bugs that they put in her car. And this is the exact same place. You know, there was early in the episode she was having lunch or breakfast with her son, and they were bugging her car, and it was like, oh, Finch, you have to get out of there. She's going back to the car. So when they do this again at the end, it's like, okay, the justification is that they do go back and debug people. They don't just keep spying on them forever. So they're giving her privacy back effectively. But it's during this moment where they, you know, through the tapped phone, that they hear this, and it's nice because it's like Reese knows that when the son asks that question, he knows that he's looking out for her. So it's this, you know, unlikely allies kind of thing, and I think all that works quite well. And there's some fun to be had along the way. You know, it's not an overly funny episode, but there is one great laugh where Carter's convincing the girlfriend of the mob boss guy that she suspects killed someone. Basically, she pits her and the guy's like sort of mistress, like the woman he has on the side, in a room with each other, and she leaves them there to fight with Fusco and just says, make sure they don't kill each other. And as she closes the door, and Fusco just looks like, what the hell have you just, you know, put in my lap? That's quite funny. That's a funny moment. You know, I got a good chuckle out of that. Fusco's an interesting character in this one as well, actually, because naturally you're talking about her not having backup from her colleagues. It does bring into this question of like, where does Fusco stand right now? And Fusco uses his old connections to go and talk to the captain and find out about, you know, what the corrupt side of the police force are doing, or what their involvement is in Carter being killed. They know about it. They know it has to look clean. They're working with the lies. We learn all that because Fusco uses his old corrupt connections. And it's interesting because when Fusco finds out at the start, you know, when it becomes clear that Carter's the one in danger, he does sound concerned. So, you know, it's sort of building that thing with him where we're sort of seeing, you know, he is human. He does care about those around him. He does care about, you know, we saw it before when he was concerned about the kid a few episodes ago, and then here again, he does seem to care that Carter's in trouble. But he does pose an interesting question to Reese, because Reese and him talk a lot over the phone in this episode. And he does say to Reese, like, isn't it technically good for you if Carter, because Carter's the only cop who is aware, well, other than Fusco, I suppose, but Fusco's obviously not in a position to, you know, hunt him down and arrest him. But Carter's the only one who's aware of him and seems interested in tracking him down. Isn't it good for you if she is taken out of the picture? And it's an interesting beat because obviously Reese is like, no, I have no interest in that. And we know he's got no interest in that because he knows Carter's a good person. That is repeated throughout the episode between him and Finch a couple times. The motivations there are clear, why he wouldn't let Carter go down. But it's interesting this coming from Fusco, because it's not like I genuinely don't think Fusco is suggesting that to be the case. I think Fusco is just prodding at the morality a bit, and maybe in a way like is almost trying to like take the emotion out of it for himself a little bit. Like maybe he shouldn't, because I think in some level, you know, Fusco, I don't think it's debatable that Fusco cares that Carter's in danger. I think he absolutely does. I don't think that is debatable. But in some level, maybe it bothers him that he cares. Maybe things were easier before when he didn't have to care. Maybe things were easier before when the other corrupt cops would just naturally have his back because he's in the corrupt cops club. You know, it's the boys club, effectively. And I think because he met with his former captain, on some level, like, it scares him that he might be technically going up against that in some level. And maybe he's trying to, like, I don't want to say play devil's advocate, because that feels not quite the right term, but certainly in pondering these questions to Reese, it's almost like he's kind of debating with his own consciousness, and not consciousness, his conscience. I always do that. Whenever I go to say conscience, I always feel like I've not said enough of a word, and I kind of like pivot into consciousness, which is not the word. It means something different, but this is something I do. But yeah, I think he's effectively wrestling with his own conscience when he's debating this with Reese. And, you know, it's, I think it's, you know, there's some cute scenes that come from this as well, you know, where they give Fusco a little, you know, bobbly police stall to spy on Carter on his desk. I enjoyed these scenes, and I also enjoyed Elias delivering flowers. Almost like Elias does take some pleasure in taunting her before she's going to be killed. Which certainly does feel even more malicious than we saw from Elias previously. Like it's one thing for him to take out the people he thinks are a problem, but it's another thing to like taunt it and throw it in their face that, hey, death is coming for you. So it definitely makes him a bit more villainous, and it's that thing as well where slowly maybe we're seeing all the comparisons between Reese and Finch and what they do and with what Carter's morals are, and why the reason why I compare it to Jim Gordon so much is because ultimately Jim Gordon starts working with Batman because he's surrounded by corrupt cops, because he needs an ally outside the system because the system's so corrupt. It does feel like we're going down a similar route with Carter, where she's realizing that the one person who has her back is the one who's working outside this system. And I think the fact that she's now been in multiple systems where she's had this problem, where she was in the military and this like sense of like morality and honor weren't surrounding her. It was all very much, no, we're on team A and we're out for ourselves. The other guys are the enemy and we're not going to humanize them in any way. We're going to, because they're the enemy, that's justification to these guys to be racist, to do whatever they're going to do. It very much becomes an us vs them thing. Whereas Carter's always trying to keep that humanity in mind. She's always trying to, like this guy that she's talking to, he obviously was a part of the system that led to the bombing of some Americans, but she's always very much conscious of the fact that this is a person who, was in his position in life, he was surrounded by certain people, and ultimately like was sympathetic to the fact that maybe he didn't have many other choices, right? This was the lot he got in life, and is trying to keep that in mind. So it does a lot to build her up as again a very sympathetic, very much heroic character that's worth saving. And certainly I think in Reese's mind, Carter to him is more worthy of not saving than anyone else. That's not what I'm trying to say. She's more, I think to Reese, Carter represents the pure version of what he is, and that Reese sees himself as someone who lost his soul a long time ago. He doesn't think he deserves a happy ending. That goes back to the whole, he'll save someone from committing revenge on the guy back in episode like 4 or 5, but he's like, nah, maybe I'm the one who'll kill the guy though, because my soul's already done. He sees himself as a lost cause who's trying to make up for all the bad things that he's done in a lot of ways. Whereas Carter is someone who's just being good. She's kind of the impossible version of what, in some level, he is. And I think that's like an interesting parallel that we're going to, keep kind of like poking at and playing with. And also it maybe sets up why eventually if Carter learns more about who Fusco is, and there's even a little tease in this episode where when they're at the crime scene early on, Fusco comes up and says, hey, we've been working with each other for a while now. Like, my friends call me Lionel. You don't have to keep calling me Detective Fusco. You got a first name. And she says, yeah, detective. And she's not ready to, have that friendship with him. Maybe because on some level she knows the people around her tend to end up corrupt or something, or like don't have her back. Maybe she specifically suspects Fusco of his past, whatever the case may be. But I think the idea that she was able to sympathize with the guy she was interrogating in the military when she was in the Middle East, I think that maybe presents the idea that on some level she'll be able to understand the situation and circumstances that Fusco was in. That's not to say that he's not guilty of making bad choices, or he shouldn't just get forgiveness for any bad things he's done, but at the very least there's some level of empathy, of understanding, okay, he's surrounded by certain people, he's convinced to do certain things, whatever it may be. The circumstances and context around the person's choices do matter as well. And I think that's something she's sympathetic to, and it's something that maybe will ultimately let her kind of, connect with him after she knows about a lot of the things that he's done. I suspect that it's going to be rough waters before then, obviously, but I could see that being the case. And so as far as like character building goes, this episode is very important, obviously specifically for Carter, but even just in how she sees Reese, how she sees Fusco. She doesn't really have any connection to Finch yet, but I'm sure we'll get there someday too. And of course, learn she has a son is an interesting tidbit. She has, she clearly was someone who has been morally pretty just for a long time. But it is notable that her son obviously still existed in the military part of her life. You know, that was the mid 2000s. I can't remember what year it was, like 2006 or 2007 or something like that. It went to. Um, you know, this idea that she talks a lot about doing the right thing for your children when she's talking to the guy. You know, when she's trying to interrogate him and convince him to give up the location. There is maybe an interesting aspect to this where a lot of what she does is the idea that she wants to make the world a better place for her son. It's a very broad idea, but I think there's an element of that in here, that in some level her motivation for being as good as she can be is because she wants to do the right thing, to be an example for her son, and also help the world be better so that her sons get a better world to live in. I do appreciate that in those scenes with her son, other than him being concerned and showing that, you know, it is scary having his mother go out and have this dangerous job, is, you know, it is mostly just this sweet stuff where she's asking him about his, you know, about going to the dance, if he's got a girlfriend, stuff like that. It's mostly sweet mother-son stuff, as opposed to just being constantly about her work. They do a good job of making sure that human element is in there instead, because I think it's a very important thing for the character that these scenes with her son are mostly like feel different from everything else. They don't feel like they're just another avenue to explore what we're doing in the other plots. It's more about saying, no, here's her life outside of that, and, you know, give her a more well-rounded life. She's got something else she fights. Obviously her job's a big part of who she is. She's very work obsessed for obvious reasons, but I think that was important to do as well. And I think another example that just showing you how different she is to the people around her is that before she's introduced in the flashbacks, because they do this thing at the start where it's this other young soldier who's talking to the guy in the interrogation room, and he's like, hey, you need to tell me where this location is, or you're going to speak to my boss, and you don't want to speak to my boss. And I think it's a little bit of a, you know, a swerve, because I think you maybe expect it to be Reese. Maybe it doesn't make sense in the time period, but I think you naturally think, oh, it's going to be Reese, or maybe somehow it'll turn out to be maybe the woman that Reese was with in his last flashbacks. You know, someone relevant to that part of the story. So it's almost like a little intentional surprise when it's Carter who walks in. We do know that she was in the military before. You know, that's came up before. She knew what the radios were back in like episode 3 or 4 because she's got experience with them. So that's something that's been set up and teased before. So it feels natural that she's here, but it's not necessarily what you expect immediately in the moment. Maybe if I'd checked the episode's name again, I would have predicted it was going to be Carter. But if you go in not knowing that that's the title, I think it's a nice little swerve. But the thing I was getting to though is that this guy, he kind of sells her like she's scary. Like it's almost like a really cliched idea that you're like, oh, you don't want to meet the boss because the boss is the scary one. He's the bad cop. He's the interrogator. And you almost expect it to be someone who comes in with like the little... in fact, we had it last episode with the ex-Nazi, or he's not an ex-Nazi, but you know what I mean. Like he's not a Nazi, but he was the guy from World War II, right? We had that character. He literally had the little case with all the knives and the blades, right, that he sort of rolled out on the table. You almost expect that to be what walks in. Someone like that who rolls out the torture devices and is going to start doing horrible things to the person. And instead, and I think that's intentional because the episode wants to point out that that's not what she is. She is this empathetical person who will appeal to someone's humanity. She is a good person. She is not the torturer. But the guy before her sells her like she's that because seemingly to all the other guys here, that's what they expect. That's what they think is going to go down, or something similar to that. It feels like she is very much this different cog in the wheel that doesn't spin with everyone else. And it's sad that the rest of the machine, if you want to call it that, is not like her. I shouldn't say machine because there is a machine on this show that we constantly refer to as the machine. So maybe that was a poor choice of words in this case. But I do think that character building for her, that analysis of her character and how she like connects and symbolically relates to the other characters in the show that she's interacted with so far, is all very good, strong stuff. And credit to the episode for being able to juggle like multiple suspects, even if the one who's going to ultimately be the danger is kind of obvious in a lot of ways, just if you're used to like, you know, writing and how it swerves you. Because you've got the gang leader who's got like, you know, people connected to him, and the store owner who's scared of him. You've got the abusive husband. And I think that one's especially quite neat because it does tie into this idea of preventing the homicide before it happens. I think that's a really good little thematic tie to everything Finch and Reese do. And then you've got, the threat of Elias looming over all of that. And you've got the CI introduced. There's a lot of things to actually play with. I think that's why Finch gets less screen time this episode, is because there's so many of these elements to juggle amongst all these other things. And I think we do tend to get a lot of whoever the person of interest is in each episode. They do tend to get a lot of their screen time. They're not just a quick guest star where we still focus mainly on Reese. It tends to be not more than Reese, but it tends to be a good significant portion where it feels like you do get to know the person. I think it's interesting in this case that because the person of interest is one of our main characters, we get to just really spend even more time with them, because it's important. Everything she's going through is not just important for this episode, it's important for the character development for a whole. We get to combine all the snippets we usually get at Carter with the target character and spend most of the episode with her. And that's great. That gives us a lot of time to get to know her and develop things. And like I say, because she is one of our main characters, everything they do with her isn't just for the purpose of this episode. And because normally it's you've got a guest character and their story will in some way relate to what Reese is going through or one of the other characters is going through. Here we just get to straight up do it with one of the actual characters, and that's pretty good. But it still relates to Reese in a lot of ways, and yeah, that makes it a pretty solid episode. Because I wasn't super hot on the last episode. It was definitely the weakest one. I think this one feels like a minor milestone in the show with the things that it approaches with the character. I think the bigger milestone is when Carter and Reese have a one-on-one conversation and have to choose to help each other in one way or another. That's going to be a huge milestone when that happens, and it's definitely going to happen. There's no doubt in my mind. And the whole threat is called off because Reese goes and threatens the corrupt cop that Lionel spoke to earlier, and basically says if anything happens to Carter, he will go on the rampage, taking down all the corrupt cops. So it scares the shit out of him. Seems to be enough for now to call off the hit, which is interesting from the larger picture perspective, because Elias said, as long as we stay out of each other's way, I like you, John, I'm not going to, as long as you don't interfere with my work, we're not going to have a problem. But very quickly, in only a couple of episodes, Reese has interfered with something Elias is doing. He's interfered and stopped this hit on Carter, so that may have repercussions. Very curious to see about that. But hey, yeah, very good. Solid episode. Had a good time. Love getting more of the character and really fleshing these relationships out a little bit. So excited to see where we go next time. But let me know what you thought of this episode of Person of Interest in the comments below. And of course, you can support all the content and keep it coming by going over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and supporting over there for however much you can afford to. And if you can't afford to give any monies, that's okay. Like, subscribe, comment, all those things do help on the YouTubes, and just help make it clear that people are enjoying the videos. It's always nice to see and does help other people find them in the long run. With the dreaded dragon that is the YouTube algorithm. What an awful beast it is. But yes, thank you once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?